Thanks, Brad. Your check's in the mail. So, first off, I'd like to give a shout out to AUT, my university. I'm getting my PhD right now through AUT. We've got a lot of, this AUT is in New Zealand. We've got a lot of good equipment to allow for some of this research to take place, like force treadmills and things like that. And this leads me into my next slide. This is my supervisor, John Cronin. This is one of my favorite quotes from John. John is a prominent researcher in strength and conditioning, and he said this to me during my first week there. He said, you know, this is what I know today. Tomorrow it's subject to change as I learn more. And I think that's important because the topic of sprinting forces it's a very interesting debate. I always laugh that we still don't have it all figured out. I think it's not that hard of a topic. If NASA decided to get to the bottom of it in a week, they could have it all figured out. We just need some more research. But nevertheless, I don't have it all figured out. No one in this room does. Even the top researchers don't have it all figured out yet. So some of this stuff might be wrong. Some of this stuff might be incomplete. But as we learn more, I will update my knowledge and be sure to point it out to you guys when new research emerges. So the great debate. This is what's kind of funny about this debate right here is we're so interested in what limits maximum speed. Is it vertical force? Is it horizontal force? Well, some of you may not be, you might not be aware that this is a kind of a raging debate in the sprinting community, in the track and field community. But you've got some very high-level people arguing one way, some other people arguing another way. And both of these groups are very, very intelligent people. They're PhD researchers. They publish research, they train sprinters. And so it's my hope that we come together over time and our viewpoints merge. But there was a point in time when if you felt one way or another, it would lead to, on the forums and things like that, these big clashes. But the good news is the researchers are aware of what needs to be researched, and there's some good research that's going to be emerging. But the ironic thing about it is we're so interested in maximum speed. And strength coaches, I'll get to this in a little bit, but it's more about acceleration. But we're so focused on maximum speed. Now, why is this important? Why should you care about sprinting forces? Does it really change the way we train people? Does it change the way you cue sprinting mechanics? Well, I believe it does. A better understanding of the mechanisms leads to more hypotheses, there should be an E, not an I, hypotheses to test, and ultimately more effective methods for improving speed development. So if we don't understand, the biomechanics of sprinting, we can't come up with the best protocols to test. Now, just because we understand the mechanisms doesn't mean that, oh, okay, I'm going to do this, this implementation and it's going to increase speed. Those require training studies, which we don't have yet, which I'm going to point out at the end. So we have a long way to go, but we're on the right path. So before we get started here, let me point some things out. A lot of you in here are strength coaches or personal trainers that work with athletes, and we all like to base what we do for speed development off of what the track and field coaches recommend and what the sprint athletes do. But we should point out that sprinters are the only athletes who accelerate for 60 meters. They will keep on increasing speed up to 60 meters. Most athletes top out at around 25 meters. That's very important. Ground sports are more about acceleration, so we should be very interested in acceleration biomechanics. And acceleration mechanics in ground sports is more upright in posture. You don't have as much forward lean. A lot of the athletes pop up quicker. Now, you can go to the NSCA website. This, in your booklet, this is I updated, I had a bunch of pictures. I took screenshots of the studies because I wanted to be able to remember the study when I saw it on the slide, but then I thought that's being lazy. I just didn't want to make the citations. So I went back and made all the citations. The updated, and the NSCA website has the updated version. So see how I put the references in there? Those you can see. So there's like 46 journal articles that I referenced throughout this slideshow. And there's a whole list on the NSCA website if you go and download that one. So just to support last slide, sprinters reach top speeds around 60 meters, but they don't maximally accelerate. This is interesting to think about because when those top sprinters, there have been a few studies that have looked at this, when the top sprinters, say you take the 100-meter sprinters and now you have them move to a 50 or 60-meter sprint, they actually, if you look at their split times, they're faster with the shorter distances. So the 100-meter sprint does not involve maximal acceleration. One study on college American football players showed that they reach top speed at around 20 meters. That's all they need to be moving as quickly as possible. And then this is interesting as well. 90% of sprints in soccer and 68% of sprints in rugby are shorter than 20 meters. So this is what I'm telling you. We should be very interested in acceleration. And then 58% of sprints in rugby are preceded by locomotion. So you don't have these, nice clean starts where you're off the blocks. You'll be moving and then you'll have to dart one way or the next. So as you can see, acceleration is vital for strength and conditioning. Nevertheless, the debate about maximum speed rages on, and the maximum speed gets all the attention. So some definitions here. I thought about making each one of these its own slide, but basically, for some of you who don't have force plates or have never seen sprinting on a force plate, I've got a couple of videos that I'm going to show you that look at the forces during sprinting. But it's important to know that, see these pictures here? So, I'm probably blocking a lot of people out on this side. So, when your foot touches down, picture that. Picture sprinting over ground and your foot touches down. These initial forces are at this angle. So you've got a vertical component and a horizontal component. But when your foot first touches down, it's pointed in this direction, and these are braking forces. They slow you down. As your leg passes over the center of mass, it becomes more vertical, and then it starts to become slanted this way as you push off, and those are propulsive forces. So you've got vertical force, and then you've got two different horizontal forces, braking and propulsive. So force is mass times acceleration. Now, power is something different. There's a couple different equations for power, but power takes into account force and velocity. You're multiplying force by velocity. Power is very important in sprinting, which I'll get to later. Impulse looks at the area under the curve. So if you've got, say this was a vertical force trace, you would look at all this area under the curve. So that has a time component. So you see these in the sprint literature all the time. And you have to know what you're looking at because they're all different. So if the study examines force, that's one thing. If it examines power or if it measures impulse, these are all different things. And they all require unique considerations. Relative, if you see the word relative, that just means that you're dividing by body weight. Okay, absolute is just the number itself. Net, you see net horizontal force a lot. If you're calculating net horizontal force, you're just taking the propulsive, those going in this direction, and subtracting out the braking going in that direction. If you are accelerating, then the net horizontal force is positive. Okay, and then with horizontal, I already explained, there's braking, there's propulsive, then you've got vertical. Now, here's resultant. The resultant forces are, see these little triangles here? So you've got vertical, you've got horizontal. The resultant would be taking both into account and doing like the Pythagorean theorem there that you learned in geometry. Finally, these last two are what I want to explain to you. These last two definitions, and this is the boring part, guys, but it's kind of important to understand. The ratio of forces would be where you divide horizontal by vertical. And there's a new researcher named J.B. Morin. He first was studying cycling. He's like a cyclist, and he studies cycling and sprinting. And they do this in cycling. They would look at the ratio of forces, and he started looking at the ratio of forces throughout the whole sprint. And so he started looking at, during the first step, the second step, and each step of a sprint, let's look at the ratio of forces and plot them on a graph. And let's calculate the slope of that line. Well, that is called the index of force application. I'll get to this later. And he has shown that this is very, very highly correlated with sprinting speed. So, okay, boring definition stuff out of the way. Now let's look at some arguments in favor of vertical force. So, the first argument that you'll see is that throughout a sprint, vertical force rises and net horizontal force diminishes to zero, so vertical force is more important. The primary proponents of this argument are a researcher named Peter Wiend, and Ralph Mann champions it as well. This is a book called The Mechanics of Sprinting and Hurdling. And Ralph Mann collected a lot of data on really good sprinters. And this is kind of these are, in my opinion, the gold standard that a lot of track and field coaches look at, these two guys here. And this is one of their arguments. And I will illustrate this in video in the next slides. So, I wonder how I play this. Oh, there you go. Okay, so check this out. Here you've got vertical and horizontal forces. Now, the first stride, they are very similar. See that? The first step. Then, already by the second step, you see more of a discrepancy. And then by the third step, you'll see even more of a discrepancy. This video is from the SMU biomechanics lab, Peter Wiend's laboratories. And you look at these forces here, and every single step, this discrepancy gets more and more between vertical and horizontal. So you see the horizontal diminishes each step, and the vertical starts to rise. Well, what's happening at maximum speed? If we play this video, check out maximum speed. One thing I'd like you to pay attention to is look at this hip. You think, like if you froze it right there, it looks like he's really high in the air. The hip does not oscillate much at all during maximum speed sprinting. So here you've got these forces, and look, the vertical force is so much higher than the horizontal. And if you looked at the horizontal, braking and propulsive are equal there. See that? If you subtract this portion, this braking, from this propulsive, they will equal zero. The net horizontal force is zero. So that's a pretty compelling argument. When you're sprinting at maximum speed, vertical forces are very high, and net horizontal force is zero. So obviously, vertical force is more important for maximum speed. Well, there's more to the story than that, okay? So, the counter argument to this, and this is something that you don't see too often. You don't see people bring this up, but the fact that horizontal force diminishes so drastically might indicate that it's the more difficult of the two components to maintain as speed rises, and therefore it might be the more critical factor. That's something you don't hear much. So because it diminishes so much, it's hard to maintain. It's hard to keep up that horizontal force as you speed up. Okay, counterargument number 2. There are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 studies here. All of these studies, I've got references in the back on the NSCA website. All of these studies look at sprinting across different speeds. So I'm going to take a runner, a sprinter, and I'm going to have him run at a certain speed, say, 3 meters per second, and then 5 meters per second, 7 meters per second, 10 meters per second. I have him run at a range of speeds, and then I look at the forces. Well, every one of these studies looks at that, and every single one of them show the same thing. Actually, I'm going to go back. I will have an example of Brugeli's study, which was done at AUT. I'll have an example of this in a minute that I'll show you. But they all show the same thing, that as you speed up, horizontal force becomes more important. Vertical force tops out around 70%. I'll show you a slide on that in a minute. All right, here's the other argument, and this is a classic study done by Peter Wien in 2000, I believe. It's a free study that you can get through the Journal of Applied Physiology. And I have the reference in the back. It's something about, God, I can't remember the title offhand. But what he found, and this was a kind of monumental in the sprint research, what he found was that faster runners produce more force. They don't spend more time in the air. They produce more force. And what he found here's the different sprinters. And you have so look at the slowest sprinter here. We're looking at just over 6 meters per second. And the faster is almost 12 meters per second there. So you've got a range of different sprinters there. There's a 1.8-fold increase in maximum velocity there, but only a 1.26-fold increase in vertical ground reaction forces. I look at this and I go, I would have expected more. If vertical force was so important, you'd expect the fastest sprinter over here to be producing way more vertical force than this slowest sprinter. Nevertheless, 2 studies by Morin, more recent studies, have shown that vertical force is indeed significantly correlated with maximum speed. These charts are too small here, but if you were to look, vertical force is in fact significantly correlated with maximum speed, so it's important. All right, now let's look at counterargument. The problem is horizontal forces are more correlated than vertical forces. The Wien study only examined vertical. Had the Wien study examined horizontal, I'm sure they would have found that the faster sprint, that horizontal is the more important of the two. Here's the study by Brugeli I told you about. And you look at this. This is percentage of maximum velocity. So they ran it between 40 and 100% of max speed. Well, check this out. So wouldn't you expect, if vertical force was so important, wouldn't you expect as you go from 40% of max speed to 100% for it to go through the roof? Well, check this out. 40% of max speed is here, 60% is here, 80 is here, 100 is here. You don't go after 60%, you don't go up much in vertical force production. Now let's look at horizontal force. Check that out. 40, 60, 80, 100. It's almost linear there, right? You've almost got a straight line there. So as you speed up, horizontal force is, from this graph, appears to be the more important factor. Now, here's where you've got to be an astute researcher. You always have to look at these studies and go, okay, what was the experience of the sprinters? Are these beginners? Are they advanced sprinters? Is it males? Is it women? Is it what are you recording the forces with? Is it over ground force plates, or is it on a forced treadmill? I have used the forced treadmill, and I will tell you, it takes some getting used to. You are tethered behind you, and it's kind of off balance. It doesn't feel the same. So a lot of the researchers who believe in vertical force, they will look at this and say, oh yeah, but it was done on a forced treadmill, and those are all, those are hogwash because the forced treadmill does not replicate maximum speed sprinting mechanics. The problem with that is that the forced treadmill, the fastest runners on the forced treadmill are the fastest runners over ground. The people who produce the highest forces on the forced treadmill are the people who produce the highest forces on the ground. So again, you need to be balanced though, but you do need to be critical of these studies. But it should be pointed out that of the studies that examine both vertical and horizontal, so when horizontal and vertical are measured, they're both measured at the same time, 13 show that horizontal is more correlated to speed and acceleration, whereas only 1 shows that vertical is more correlated. And I have these referenced later on. Okay, here's another thing. Vertical force is not maximized when sprinting. If you wanted to, when you're sprinting, you could actually produce more vertical force. Now, the argument could be you could also produce more horizontal force. Sprinting is more of a blend of the two. If you were running and then you just decided, I want to produce more vertical force, you could just jump while you're sprinting. Yeah, your vertical force would go way up, but you would slow down, right? So this is a study by Wien that was interesting. He had people, God, it's hard to see this. He had people, I can't see the charts real well, but one did hopping and one did sprinting. And they showed that, okay, this is the vertical, this is hard to see, sorry about this, guys. I think this is the sprinting and this is the hopping, but you get more, I think they did the traces there. You can produce more force when you hop compared to when you sprint, indicating that we're not using all of our vertical force production when you sprint. And then here's some interesting stuff. This is actually a cool study done by Ralph Mann, and he looked at body vertical speed between good, average, and poor sprinters. Look at this. The good sprinters have less body vertical speed than the poor sprinters. And then here's a couple of quotes here. And you've seen this in 2 different studies, one by Hunter and one by Mann, where they say, any excess vertical, you just want to produce as much vertical force as what's needed to raise the center of mass slightly to allow your leg to come back, to come up and come back around and then reproduce horizontal forces. So that's been concluded by a couple of different researchers. So are you trying to maximize vertical force? Or are you trying to is there a sweet spot? Are you trying to minimize it? These are things that we need to figure out. Okay, here's another argument that's used by the vertical force community. You will hear this a lot. They'll say sprinting is akin to a bouncy ball or a skipping stone. The momentum is built up and it continues on its own. Now, there's a slow motion video that's really interesting of Asafa Powell sprinting. And I wanted to play it here, but the file was so large because it's a very long video clip. But it looks so effortless when he's sprinting at maximum speed, even in slow-mo. He looks so smooth and so effortless. When you talk to top sprinters, they kind of tell you that's how it feels, However, if you took a stone and skipped it, if you took a bouncy ball, this is not a good analogy because that bouncy ball, each time it bounces, it loses speed, it loses forces. When you throw that skipping stone, it loses force every time it hits the water and it comes to a stop. That's not what we want in sprinting. You don't want to come to a stop. You want to keep going. You want to power through it. So counter-argument to that is, This took me a while. I thought this research would be readily available, and this took me forever to find research on this stuff. But each stride, you have losses of between, depending on the study, 1.4 and 4.8% of horizontal velocity during the braking phase. So just during the braking phase, you can lose, between 1.5 and 5% just of speed just during the braking phase. And then in flight, you lose around 2% just from drag and wind resistance. So you have to overcome these, right? You have to reproduce this. You have to, muscles have to contract to produce joint torques, to produce ground reaction forces, to keep powering that sprinter forward. If you do not do that, what happens? You slow down. So this is kind of key. And these get higher, these get harder to maintain as you speed up. You have more wind resistance, more drag. This is a nice little graphic here from Hunter's paper. So you've got body weight. These are the three primary forces working on a sprinter: wind resistance, body weight, and then the ground reaction force. Okay. Obviously, I already mentioned this. Bouncing balls and skipping stones slow down and come to a stop. That's not what we want in sprinting. In sprinting, you want to keep accelerating, and then you want to maintain maximum speed as long as you can. I always think of I think of it this way, and this might be a very poor way of thinking of things, but if I said, I'm going to give you like a little jet pack while you sprint, well, where would you place the rockets? What angle? Would you put them beneath you, angling, would you point them angling that way when you sprinted? No, you'd point them pointing that way to propel you. Well, maybe you'd need an angle to prevent you from face planting, but the point is, to me, it makes sense that you'd want them driving you that way, producing more horizontal force. You'd be faster. And that's, again, maybe that's a very poor way of looking at things, but I look at that and go, it's so logical to me. That's why I have that picture there. Checking the time here. Okay, so arguments in favor of horizontal force. All right, this is a busy, noisy slide. I apologize. But here's all the studies I told you about, and I have them all referenced. Okay? Horizontal variables are correlated with acceleration, vertical, and, sorry, let me get this right. When I say horizontal variables, I mentioned to you earlier, a lot of the studies will look at force, some look at power, and some look at impulse. But whatever they're looking at, whether it's force, power, impulse, horizontal is always correlated with acceleration. But vertical and total is resultant. Those are synonymous with one another. They're not always correlated. So during acceleration, horizontal is always correlated, almost always. And then horizontal variables are correlated with maximum velocity to a higher degree. So again, vertical force is correlated with max speed, but not with acceleration. However, when vertical and horizontal are both examined, horizontal is more important. And then horizontal power is always highly correlated. I don't think I've ever seen a study where horizontal power wasn't significantly correlated with maximum speed or acceleration. So here's all the studies that you can look at. This Lockheed study, it just got, it's funny, last year I presented with John Cronin. We did a pre-conference talk, and I said there's not a single article out there where vertical force is shown to be more important than horizontal. And of course, as soon as I said that, published ahead of print was this Lockheed paper. And it shows, but it's weird because you will find a paper here and there where it shows vertical is more important. I don't know what explains that. It's using soccer athletes, or it's hard. You look at this and you just got kind of go, I don't know. But that's why you have to look at the entire body of literature. So these are some cool studies by Marin. Faster sprinters are able to keep producing positive net horizontal force at increasingly faster speeds with shorter contact times. So again, you look at the works of Marin. Now this paper is not yet published, but I got his permission. This is going to be a really cool study, assuming it gets accepted. So he he looked at, basically did a virtual sprint. They took force plates and moved them. So they had multiple trials of sprints, but they had these sprinters. First they had the force plates at like 0 to 10, then 10 to 20, then 20 to 30. So they got this trace of an entire 40-meter sprint, and they were able to calculate all the different things that you'd want to look at. They looked at impulse here, but they looked at resultant, vertical, net horizontal, braking, and propulsive, and you can see it off the starting blocks, the 0 to 20, 20 to 40, and the entire 40-meter sprint. And when you look at these things, it becomes pretty apparent that horizontal is superior. This is going to be a really cool paper when it gets published. So here's the problem, guys. You have increasingly faster sprint times. It becomes harder and harder to produce horizontal force. And this is here's a cool study on Christopher Lemaitre. I can't say it properly. But he's a French sprinter. I think he's the fastest white sprinter in the world. Now, you look at, here's Christopher Lemaitre, and then here's the national level, and then the non-specialist. And this is what I told you about this index of force application. This is a really cool thing. Remember, they plotted the ratio of forces at every single stride in the sprint. So you're dividing horizontal by vertical forces, and then plotting them, and then taking the slope of that line. And Lemaitre is way faster. So let me explain this in an analogy so it makes sense to you. Let's say that some of you are pretty fast sprinters, and then you've got like me, who's like a slow sprinter, and then you've got like a world-class sprinter in the audience. And you put like a heavy sled in front of us, or a truck or something, and we have to push it. And we started out. Here's what would happen. We start pushing. All right, we all probably would start accelerating at a similar pace, right? Lemaitre does not start off with more horizontal force than everyone. The problem is I'd start going at a certain speed, I'd reach a certain rate, and all of a sudden I couldn't accelerate it anymore. I top out, I peter out. I can't keep accelerating this thing. So you guys start to pass me up. Well, then all of a sudden you guys get to a point where all of a sudden you can't keep pushing this thing faster. Well, that's where Lemaitre takes off and takes away. He keeps producing increasing horizontal force. He keeps accelerating, and he's more horizontal force dominant as speed keeps going, and that's why he keeps accelerating. I surmise that Usain Bolt would be the same way. So you look at how he compares, and he has a totally different slope. This is that index of force application. This is very important. His index of force application is very different from the other sprinters, and this is a very significantly correlated aspect of sprinting speed. Over here, you've got his power velocity curve, and here's the slowest sprinter. You can barely see it here. This little, see the power? This is horizontal power. Look at Lemaitre. Huge differences there, and they're not even in the same ballpark. Okay, here are some other interesting things. We lose more horizontal ground reaction force than vertical ground reaction force as we age. So horizontal diminishes more so than vertical as we age. And that's why we slow down. Okay? We lose more horizontal ground reaction force than vertical ground reaction force in repeated sprints. You look at repeated sprints, people get fatigued. They can't maintain the same speed. Well, what's going down more, vertical or horizontal? Horizontal is. Let's look at hamstring injuries. Hamstring injuries slow people down, right? Well, you look at, here's the injured group, here's the non-injured group. Look at vertical force. Here's the injured leg, here's the non-injured leg. You produce the same vertical force with the injured and non-injured leg, but look at horizontal. 175 versus 324. Those aren't even the same ballpark, right? And this was a cool study by Jordan Mendeguccia, and he's in Spain. And he showed that it took 2 months to restore those horizontal forces to the hamstring recuperated, and then speed caught back up. So if vertical force was the most important thing, then why wouldn't vertical force be affected? Okay, this was interesting. Wearing sprinting spikes compared to barefoot increases horizontal ground reaction force, but not vertical force. Well, people can run faster in spikes than they can barefoot. Vertical forces aren't affected much. 2184 newtons versus 2169 newtons, but horizontal 622 versus 571. Horizontal forces are affected more. Now, this wasn't significant, but it might have been a type 2 error because it was a very small sample size. Okay, this is kind of cool. Let's look at Oscar Pistorius. Oscar Pistorius here, these blades are interesting to study here. If you look at him compared to other sprinters, his vertical force is less, a little bit less. His propulsive forces are very similar, but his braking is way lower. He's got way lower braking forces. Well, when you have lower braking forces, you have greater net horizontal force. So that's why he's able to run so fast. So again, these when you decrease braking forces, you can increase speed as well. There's more to the story than that. 2 papers, one by Hunter and one by K.W. Moray, I believe, showed that the fastest sprinters do not decrease braking forces compared to the slower sprinters, but Morin's coming out with a really cool paper, the one that I showed you earlier, and that one does, when you look at the faster sprinters, do brake less and push more. In fact, that's going to be the title of the study. Okay, horizontal force is more affected around curves. When you sprint around a curve, this is vertical force of the inside and outside leg. This is horizontal force of the inside and outside leg. As you can see, horizontal is more affected. Okay, so taking all these things into consideration, again, you got to look at the entire body of literature. You guys might come to a different conclusion. As long as you're evidence-based, you can have a different conclusion than me. It's not set in stone yet, but here's my conclusion. All right, vertical force is important for maximum speed. However, horizontal force is more important, and it's also much more related to acceleration. Okay, so that leads us to the next question, and this is, for you guys who are looking for practical information, this is the most important part of the talk. How do we increase horizontal force, impulse, and power? All right. This has yet, real quick, my time, is it 9:10 right now? So 20 more minutes, correct? 40 minutes left, okay. All right, good. Okay, how do we increase horizontal force, impulse, and power? All right, this is the question, you guys. We don't know the answer. I can tell you a lot of things that might work, but we need training studies to show that they work. We can speculate, all of you can come up with ideas, but ideas are just ideas. They need to be, we need training studies to validate those ideas. So here are some ideas. One thing about sprinting is that the muscles have unique responsibilities. Now this paper was done on walking. I have not seen one on sprinting. In fact, I emailed the researchers and told them they should do one on sprinting. They said they're considering it. But you look at, here's net force, here's horizontal, and here's vertical. So the blue line is horizontal, the red line is vertical. So here's the soleus, and you can see what it does for vertical and what it does for horizontal forces. So you can see here that in walking, the soleus does both, right? It has responsibilities for both vertical and horizontal force. Here's the gastrocnemius, tibialis anterior, gluteus maximus, the vastes, rectus femoris, hamstrings. So you can look at these and kind of say, oh, interesting, glute max, all right? It has responsibilities. Okay, blue line is horizontal, so it's pushing you forward, but the red line is vertical. It's also supporting the vertical aspect, right? Preventing the pelvis from collapsing. So it's interesting here. Look at the hamstrings here. This is during walking, guys, but the hamstrings have almost no responsibility for vertical, And look at the blue. They have a lot of responsibility for horizontal. I bet the hamstrings is going to become more and more important as you speed up, right? So you have to consider what muscles. So you kind of got to take a step back and look at sprinting and say, what muscles are kind of designed? What, you know, to me, the hamstrings and the glutes. But can the quads help? Well, there's some papers looking at segmental interaction of like opposite limbs and things. And some studies do show that the quads can produce horizontal force. And then there's a classic paper written years ago. The title of the study and the authors are, it's a free paper that if you ever do searching online, you always access it. But they showed that for the vasties to produce horizontal force, you'd have to be kind of like this way. So then when knee extension occurred, but you got to kind of take a step back and try to start analyzing things and say, what muscles are best suited to produce vertical force? What muscles are best suited to produce horizontal force? And we need more of this research on sprinting to show. Right now, we just have to use common sense. A lot of track and field athletes would say, we need glutes and hamstrings. Does that mean quads are not important? Does that mean calves are not important? Which is more important? Well, we've kind of hit them all in our training. But keep in mind, all right, when considering the force velocity curve for sprinting, pay more attention to the velocity side of the curve than the force side. Sprinting, if you look at Lemaitre and these guys, their maximum total force production and horizontal force production is similar to everyone else. But their maximum velocity for horizontal force, the velocity side of the power equation is they're way more geared towards velocity. All right, they might, you know, Lemaitre probably can't produce more force than most of the people in here at maximum force. But when velocity is a factor, he's going to blow us away. So sprinting speed and acceleration are more about velocity than force. Okay, rapid knee flexion, hip extension torque. All right, this is hip extension torque this way, and then knee flexion torque is this way. I've heard in track and field, I've heard the argument that, like, you know, glute ham raises or Nordic ham curls or leg curls aren't important because the argument is when you perform hip flexion and raise the leg up, this leg curling action, the knee flexion action happens passively. Well, that might be true, but that's not what we're talking about. When your leg is coming down in sprinting and it reaches, you know, like right here, your hamstrings start pulling from both ends. They start producing knee flexion torque. And then when you touch the ground, the hamstrings are working as hip extensors and knee flexors to pull your center of the mass over, you know, over the leg. Hamstrings are very, very important from both knee flexion and hip extension aspect. And there's about 3 studies now showing that hamstrings are more important in the air as hip extensors. Glutes are more important on the ground as hip extensors. And this has implications which I'll discuss on next slide. So think about that. Hammies in the air, glutes on the ground. Okay, now, like the Wien study and some of these studies say, okay, the faster sprinters aren't spending more time in the air. Right, but they are moving their legs through more range of motion. They have more hip flexion. You look at, if you watch videos of me sprinting, I probably get my leg up to here. If you look at Usain Bolt and these fast sprinters, they're getting up to here. So they have more range of motion around the hips. They have more angular velocity. They're moving their limbs at higher velocities. Okay, and kind of one thing to keep in consideration, a lot of the top track and field specialists will say focus on front side mechanics and minimize backside mechanics. What they mean is this aspect happening in front of the body is more important than this aspect here, because a lot of sprinters don't reach, they're not getting into a ton of hip hyperextension. And this is true. So you want to set yourself up to produce good forces. The faster you can get that leg swing down, that can help you minimize braking forces, and that way you don't need to produce as much propulsive to have positive net horizontal force. So to reiterate that, increased hip flexion range of motion and hip extension angular velocity plus knee flexion angular velocity during the swing probably equates to decreased braking forces, and that's what you see in these elite sprinters. Okay, ankles transmit power into the ground, don't forget about that. You can have strong hips or powerful hips, but you also need your ankles to be working properly. And it's not just about stronger muscles. There's a huge technical component to sprinting. You can't have, meathead strength coaches like me who just focus on strength and power going in and, I'd probably, if I don't train elite sprinters, if I did, I'd probably have a big learning curve. I'd go in there thinking I'm just going to get them super strong and powerful with these weight training exercises and ignore technique, and that would not be optimal. There's a huge technical component, and any increases in strength and power need to be blended into mechanics. Okay, so next slide. Here are some possibilities. A couple slides ago, I had Michael Jordan like this. How do we increase horizontal force? I don't know. You guys don't know. We have some ideas. This needs to be shown in studies. So I'm going to tell you why each of these ideas might work. How many minutes do I have left? 22 minutes? Okay, good. All right. Here's why these might work. First of all, sprints. Obviously, sprints are going to be the most important thing if you want to increase speed, right? You want to increase speed, have them sprint. All sprinters sprint. Sprinting is the most important thing. That's the law of specificity, right? Towing. What can towing do? Well, this is one of the situations where I had the quote from John Cronin, my supervisor. We actually had this discussion. It makes sense. You have people push or pull heavy sleds, right? What is that going to do? That's going to increase their force capabilities, and they're going to push harder when they sprint. They're going to create increased horizontal force, right? Well, one study, a recent study by Keiwei Mori, showed that heavy sled towing was in fact better for sprint speed than light sled towing, which is contrary to what a lot of the track and field specialists would always say. They had this 15% rule. Keiwei Mori's research showed that heavy sled towing was better for speed improvements, but it did not do so through increasing horizontal force. It did so by decreasing vertical force and improving the technical efficiency. So that's where John and I said we've got to update our knowledge. We thought sleds worked through increasing horizontal force, but it actually just increased their technical abilities. Okay? How about bounding and horizontal plyos? Okay? I think those would work because there's one study that's showing the ground reaction forces. You've got higher force production, higher power, well, maybe not power production. It looked at force. You've got higher force production with these horizontal plyos and bounding. So that's going to help you increase horizontal force. That's the theory. You need training studies showing this. I can speculate, but maybe it would be like the sled towing study where it didn't increase horizontal force. Maybe it decreases vertical or something like that. Okay, eccentric and long length hamstring exercises. Here's an interesting aspect to eccentric and long length exercises. And this could be, I'm sure some researchers like Tony Blazevich could give a whole hour-long presentation about this. But there's some research showing that when you do eccentrics or when you do exercise that move you into a stretch and that have their peak torque in the stretch position, those shift the torque angle curve to longer muscle lengths. This is where it's kind of cool to have a team of good researchers working together. I remember when I was at AUT, a researcher named Matt Brugelli, he's my good friend, he's saying, yeah, but you need the muscles working well at long muscle lengths. They got to be firing hard at long muscle lengths. And I went, well, hold on. Because he's always thinking about hamstrings, and he has a lot of research on hamstrings. But I'm known as the glute guy, so I'm always thinking about glutes. Well, I'm like, when your leg touches down, the hamstrings might be at a long muscle length, but the glutes are at a short muscle length. So I'm always thinking, okay, glutes need to be functioning at a short muscle length, functioning well, and hamstrings need to be functioning well at a long muscle length. However, then what am I doing? I'm making the mistake of thinking that the ground is the only important component, and what you do in the air is also important. So it's good to have different researchers looking at different angles, having different angles on things, because then we started thinking, well, what are the muscle lengths in the air versus on the ground? Is one phase more important than the other? But I will argue that when you're on your ground, the ground is your window to influence your speed. You can't influence your speed when you're in the air, but what you do in the air sets you up for what's done on the ground. So an interesting aspect of eccentric and long length hamstring exercises. You give people Nordic ham curls, you give people RDLs, things like that that stretch you. You tested them on an isokinetic dynamometer. It's a piece of equipment that lets you measure your torque angle curves, and you will see that you shift them to longer muscle lengths, meaning they produce their greatest torque or their greatest force at longer muscle lengths. Okay, so how is that happening? In rats, it has been shown that it happens through increased sarcomerogenesis, meaning you get sarcomeres in series added. You actually add muscle length. That has not been shown in humans. We speculate, but there is a researcher named Tony Blazevich who doubts this. He thinks it's affected through stiffness. Either way, he has an important study. Blazevich has a study showing that it only happens for 5 or 6 weeks. I mean, think about it. If we were increasing muscle length, you're lengthening muscle. You would get to a point, this is why I always laugh at the Pilates, long, lean muscles. If you were really lengthening muscles, you'd get to a point where they wouldn't stabilize the joints. They get too long, you know? They need to be a precise, relationship there. So do you increase muscle length or do you just affect stiffness, what's going on? But you do shift the torque angle curve with these. And here's what's interesting. If you can increase sarcomerogenesis, if you can increase the muscle length, that actually leads to faster muscle contractions. So that could be an important component, or it could be a dead end. We don't really know, but eccentric and long length hamstring exercises seem to be, the Nordic ham curl, the RDL or SLDL, stiff-legged deadlift, straight-leg deadlift, whatever you call it, those seem to be popular exercises in the sprint communities. All right, how about end-range hip extension glute exercises? I like, if you've followed my work at all, my blog, my articles, I've been a champion of the hip thrust exercise. All right, we always have, for a long time, there have been popular glute exercises, squats, lunges, deadlifts. And these exercises have their peak torque in the stretch position, right? Peak hip extension torque. Deadlifts right here. The hardest part of a deadlift for hip extension torque is right here. As you move up, in terms of hip extension torque, it gets easier and easier. The hip extension torque decreases. As the bar moves up, it becomes closer to the hip. Now, that doesn't mean people sometimes struggle at the lockout. There's more to it than that. It could be fatigue. It could be their spinal posture influences that. However, you take a squat, it's hardest down deep. Up top, the squat is unloaded on the hips, right? If you're just standing here with the bar, now one person might argue that you are stabilizing, but in terms of hip extension, it's not that hard. The hardest part is at the bottom. So we're already doing squats, lunges, good mornings, Olympic lifts, deadlifts, things like that. We've been doing a good job of strengthening the glutes down here. Well, how can we strengthen the glutes up here where it's more associated with ground contact? This is where exercises like hip thrusts, barbell glute bridges, back extensions done properly, this is where these exercises come into play. Because a horizontal back extension, right, or a 45-degree hyper, you come up, you squeeze the glutes. You are strengthening it in a neutral hip extension posture. We had a good article published in the SCJ looking at the torque angle curves of these different exercises. The good morning, the back extension, the 45-degree hyper. I published it with my professor, John Cronin, and my friend, Brad Schoenfeld. Pull that one up. It's called Are All Hip Extension Exercises Created Equal? But you look at these torque angle curves and you can speculate that they're going to have different effects, not only for hypertrophy, but also for performance. But again, this is just a theory. It has not been shown in training, in a chronic training study. Okay, explosive lifts and vertical plyos. All right, you can't argue that you have very rapid contact. In one study, showed that Tyson Gay had 0.07 second ground contact time during maximum speed sprinting. 0.07 seconds. Your window of opportunity becomes shorter and shorter. The stronger and more powerful, I would say not the stronger, the more powerful your calf muscles are, the more powerful your vertical force production capabilities are. If you have some reserve strength there, you're not maxing it out. You're not using it to its full capacity. The easier that is for you, you can dedicate more resources to the horizontal aspect. One really cool study published last year by a researcher named Dorn. I don't think I have this reference, so those of you taking notes might want to write this down. The first 3 words are muscular strategy shift by Dorn. I think it's a free paper that you can access. It's a really cool paper that breaks it down. And they looked at up to 7 meters per second. What increased your speed and your stride length and everything was the gastrosoleus complex. But then the force velocity properties of the gastrosoleus complex were maxed out at around 7 meters per second. So at that point, it became the hips, the iliopsoas, the hamstrings, and the glutes that increased speed. So if we can shift that to longer, the gastrosoleus complex, can we influence it through training to make it keep producing more rapid power production? That might be able to affect speed. Okay, hip flexion exercises. There's really only, I think there's one study with bands looking at hip flexion, and it showed that it did increase speed. And there might be more. I know there's different research. I know. I think it was Asafa Powell was shown to have like twice as much or 3 times more hip flexor mass than like an average person. We need more research on hip flexion, but I always say, hip flexion, if the faster you can cycle your legs, the more you can set yourself up for hip extension. And we do all this hip extension stuff in sprinting. Why not throw in one hip flexion exercise, It's not like anyone wakes up the next day and goes, oh my God, I'm crushed. I did that cable hip flexion. I did that 2 sets of band hip flexion, I'm crushed. I like to do 2 different types of hip flexion exercises, because if you just attach a cable and go like this, it's easy here and it's hard here. So one thing that was interesting when I did EMG research, when I would do like a Bulgarian split squat or a lunge, I know you're supposed to keep all your weight on your front foot, but apparently I don't. I cheat. I find good ways to cheat, but my hip flexor activity was higher in this rear leg doing heavy Bulgarian split squats and heavy like static lunges than when I would do hip flexion exercises. So when we do the single leg stuff, we might be inducing adaptations in the hip flexors. But I like to think of it like, how can I load up the stretch position and how can I load up the extended? Same with hip extension. How can I load up here in hip extension? Squats, deadlifts. How can I load up here in hip extension? Hip thrusts, barbell glute bridges, back extensions. You've got a good variety of tools here. What's the best way to blend it together? I don't know. We have to figure this out together. The strength coaches, the researchers. All right, so more research is needed. We need more acute studies to better understand the mechanisms of interventions. There are a few studies here with bounding, hopping, stepping, sprinting, towing, sleds, and vest. In fact, Cronin, Brugeli, and another guy just looked at weighted at sleds. At weighted vest sprinting. Keiwe Mori last year looked at sled towing. Acutely, what happens? What are you doing to the forces when you wear a vest? When you push a sled, what happens to the forces? What both these studies found was that you need to go a little bit heavier than you think till you're affecting horizontal force production or vertical force production. You actually can not exceed vertical force production when you sprint with a light vest, and same with horizontal force production with a light sled. So the acute studies help us come up with hypotheses for training studies, right? We need more longitudinal training studies to determine the mechanical factors involved in acceleration and speed improvements, meaning, guess what? I trained these 5 people or 10 people for 6 months. They got faster. They got markedly faster. Well, what happened to their force, power, and impulse production? There really aren't studies looking at that right now. That would be useful. More longitudinal training studies to determine the effects of various interventions. Like right now there's one looking at heavy versus light sled towing, but we need more training studies. These people did, heavy squats. They increased their speed. What happened to their force production? Did it increase their vertical? Did it decrease their vertical? Did it increase their horizontal force? We need a lot of research in this area. And what I'll end here is saying not all training studies show improvements. This is not published yet. It's a really exciting, so for me, I was very excited because I went, my colleague Jordan Mendigutsky, he's in Spain, he came up with the ultimate training study. And this is what I'm here to talk to you about, being a good researcher here. Sometimes you think you know something and a study comes out and you're like, oh well. To me, he created the greatest training study, but he used soccer players. And I can, things happen and you just have to kind of speculate and say, oh, okay, I'm gonna wait for more research to emerge. But he created a really cool study using all my favorite things. He and I are on the same page. The hip thrust, he used the hip thrust exercise. This is the first training study using the hip thrust. He used eccentric hamstring exercises. I like eccentric hamstrings. He used sleds, he used sprints. That's a no-brainer, right? You're gonna increase horizontal force, you're gonna increase speed. Well, it hasn't been published yet, but no changes in force production, no changes in speed. Wah, wah. So when that happens, you go, okay, there are studies showing that squats don't increase speed. There are studies showing that sprints don't increase speed. There are studies showing that sprints do increase speed. There are studies showing that squats do increase speed. You need a large body of literature. You need a lot of studies, and then you look at the entire thing. So you can speculate. I could say, well, it was soccer players. Maybe they were fatigued. The loads that they used for the hip thrust were very light. My guys are using way more weight. But you go back to the drawing board. Thank you very much for attending. Those of you who like my stuff, you can go to my website. I've written a lot about sprinting and things like that, a lot about glutes. I've got a lot of videos and things like that. If some of you don't know about the hip thrust and you want to know about form, I've got instructional videos on there. Thank you for attending. I'm going to stay here and answer some questions. I'm sure some of you have some. Do we have time for me to? Time for questions? Okay, go ahead.
Is there any research out there that you're aware of that looks at accommodating resistance with complex movements and how that affects
No, there's not. Torque? There's lots. Okay, so like Escamilla did a lot of research on the hip extension torque, and Swinton has done some with like squats and deadlifts and things like that. But when you use chains, I believe Swinton did something with the hex bar deadlift. But I don't know if he looked at hip extension torque. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking just use chains. I still don't think you get, like if you want to maximize hip extension torque right here, squats still wouldn't do it with chains. It would shift the curve. It would definitely shift the curve. Would it maximize things? To me, I think you need multiple exercises rather than trying to just find one magic one that's going to do it all. Good question. Next.
Hi, I'm Kayla. I'm from Arizona. And you might not know the answer to this, but I'm wondering if ground slope would affect whether you use horizontal or vertical force.
Repeat that. Wondering if what would affect horizontal and vertical?
I'm wondering if the ground slope, like if you're running on a hill.
Slope of the ground, yes, definitely. Yeah. It definitely affects force production big time if you're running on sloped surfaces. Yep, and it affects muscle activation. If you're running downhill, you're going to be using more eccentric forces. Uphill is mostly concentric. It affects everything.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Hold on 1 sec. We'll get Melanie, and then you come up to the microphone so you're ready for next one.
So if you're pulling sleds, is there any research showing where the ideal place to, is it a harness, is it a belt?
Good
that make
question. Melody asks, ideal sled attachment placement. Yes, there is some research showing that attaching it to the waist, but this was not a training study. Remember, if you always have to look at a study and say, is it mechanistic or is it, is it longitudinal? Is it a training study? There is one study showing you get greater hip extension torque when you attach it to the waist compared to the shoulders. The waist is always better for hip extension demands. So the more horizontal you can get it, the better, in my opinion. Good question. Next.
Bret, I'm wondering if you've come across anything with kettlebell swings. Just your thoughts on kettlebell swings for increasing
Kettlebell
horizontal.
swings. It's a funny story. I wrote an article for T-Nation, tnation.com. It's a popular strength and conditioning website. And they change my titles, which you'd never see that in peer-reviewed publishing, right? But I wrote an article, and then they changed the title on me to, "Are heavy kettlebell swings better than deadlifts?" And I'm like, oh, great. I'm going to piss off a lot of people here. But I love kettlebell swings. I don't like using super light. I think this goes to my biases as a lifter. I just hate high reps. I know high reps are good for a lot of things. They're good for hypertrophy. They're good for speed or for endurance. Not so good for strength, but the burn, I like to do, anything for me over 3 reps and I'm winded. So I find ways to make things harder. That's why I put a barbell in my lap and started doing the bridge motion, because I'm like, I don't want to do sets of 50. I want to do set of 5. Well, same with swings. So I have in my garage, I've got a 106-pound kettlebell and a 203-pound kettlebell. And I will tell you, that 203, it's like a cannonball. And I got really good at it. I love the swings. I want more research on the swings. There's a researcher named Lake. He does some great research. He's in the UK. He's going to be looking at things like where do you get maximum power output? With different training, like jump squats. You guys know what the load that maximizes power in a jump squat? It's body weight, no load. So you don't even want to use load if you're trying to maximize power output in a jump squat. You use just body weight. With Olympic lifts, it's like 85% of 1 rep max. You don't get much difference between the loads though, but you can go heavy on the Olympic lifts to maximize power output. Swings, we don't know yet. I'm wondering if it's heavier because it's kind of like an Olympic lift, but I love the swings, and here's why. First, there's a few reasons why. First, it seems easier to teach. Like me, my body, I am not very good at Olympic lifts. That doesn't make me anti-Olympic lifting in my training of other people if they're well suited for it. But I can power clean more than I can front squat, and it just never feels good to catch up here. I want to catch it down here. So for me and certain athletes, they're not coordinated with Olympic lifts, but you give them swings and they can learn it so much faster. I also would like to see hip power. You calculate hip power by multiplying hip extension torque by hip extension angular velocity. And I think that swings would maximize hip power compared to any other implement. And that's something that I think we need to look at. How do you maximize joint power in your training? And instead of looking at the load that optimizes system power, let's look at the loads that optimize joint power of hip extension and stuff. And I think swings, they'd be, because you got constant torque on the hips. You're loaded down here, and if you do it right, you are pushing the whole way through and lock it out, and squeezing your glutes at lockout. It's an awesome exercise. I like those for training power. I like those, but for training power, that's a whole other topic. Heavy loads increases power. Combined training increases power. You don't just want to do one thing. You want to do heavy, you want to do explosive training, you want to do plyos, you want to do sprints, you want to do towing. They all help. But I like hex bar jump squats. One study by, it was either Comfort or Swinton. I think it was Swinton. Looked at, I think it was Comfort actually, Paul Comfort. He looked at jump squats where you put the bar on your back or held a hex bar. And he found that, I think that it was college athletes, I believe, they got more force or power production when they held on the hex bar in their hands rather than put it on their back. So I like hex bar jump squats and heavy kettlebell swings for power production along with all the other things. Any other questions?
Are there any studies as far as anchoring on the ground or anchoring directly behind you? Which one is preferable, using elastic or bands?
Anchoring with
Yeah.
elastic?
Well, or bands. I mean, you know, anchoring to a belt, of course. Working on speed
Like,
drills.
like anchoring and just kind of doing sprints? I have
Yeah.
not seen any research on that.
As far as
Yeah.
vertical, horizontal per se.
Right, yeah, I have not seen any. There might be, I just might not be aware of it. I haven't located any though. Good
Okay.
question. Anyone else? Okay guys, thank you very much. I'll stick around if you've got some other questions. Thank